America has a bit of a gambling problem. And no, I'm actually not talking about taking risks on grand geopolitical moves and military strategies, though you could definitely probably make an argument there considering everything else that has been going on. No, I am referring to actual gambling in the most classic sense possible: sports betting. Actually, wait, no. Unfortunately, at this point, thanks to things like Kalshi, I'm not even referring to just sports betting anymore. We're talking about betting on anything and everything, which if you look at the annoying ads for Kalshi that pop up everywhere, this will range from what the temperature in your local area will reach to, whether or not a specific word will be used in the latest South Park episode, or, and hear me out on this, it's not just the whimsical and simple stuff. It is bets on casualties of war and whether or not the US would bomb Iran or attack Venezuela or other things like that. Because yes, that actually happened. And now kids are going and developing gambling addictions, and young adults, especially men, are going heavily into debt in order to gamble, potentially setting themselves back by literally years. I swear, the more that I go on about this, I'm going to sound like some kind of activist out of like the early 1900s, pre-prohibition, that is trying to do something here, but you all do not understand just how bad things have gotten. And when I say that, I'm trying to be as serious and as forthright with you as I can. I am genuinely struggling with how to actually start this video, per se, because we are not covering a specific event necessarily here in history and then going back in history to try and explain it. No, what we are doing is we are tackling a problem that has always kind of existed within humanity itself, but in the past several years, it has gotten significantly worse within the United States.
Oh yeah, and also side note here, I know that every single time that I go and travel, the world decides to light itself on fire. If you want to be potentially part of that experience, you can join me in Greece or Croatia or Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Yeah, we're going to be doing a lot of trips here, and if you really want to travel with me this summer to Greece and Croatia, the spots for that are going to be expired in like 3 weeks now, I think at this point. It's like the last chance to be able to get tickets to travel with me here this summer. So if you want to go on an adventure and learn some history, do that. And then we can potentially watch the world burn. Oh my God, this week has been absolutely insane.
When the Supreme Court struck down the federal ban on sports betting back in the year 2018, Americans legally wagered less than $5 billion on sports annually. That was something that always existed, but it was smaller and way more localized. Last year, it was over $150 billion. That is a little bit of an increase. What has emerged, my friends, isn't just a bigger gambling market, but a public health crisis that is in the making, with young men as its primary casualties, and that is something that we really have to get into here, because this has dark consequences for the future. Today, 90% of bets are placed on phones, not at casinos, not at racetracks, not at a physical building. More than half are live bets, placed while games are still in progress. When you go and open any betting app, you will go and find hundreds of options per game. Not just, oh, which one is going to win, but how many yards are going to be run instead of passed in a Patriots game. Whether Shohei Ohtani will get a home run, or the number of fouls that will occur in the next Lakers game. All of this is something that is factored in. It could be quite literally anything, and what I just listed here is just the sports side. In fact, for the purpose of this video, I looked up some examples of the weirdest bets that were happening this week on Polymarket, and I'm sure that my editor can go ahead and put those up here for what it is that I am talking about. I'll need to go ahead and send them in the links. But I saw, just literally on the front page as I opened it up, who will be the next Prime Minister of Hungary? When will the US confirm the existence of aliens? Or, I think among all the things I saw in there, my personal favorite one that I have found, because of how stupidly specific it is the number of tweets that Elon Musk will make between the days of March 27th and April 3rd of 2026. That is right. People are going and betting how many tweets Musk will make within just a certain time frame. What I am naming here is just a few of the hyper-specific bets that are underway. But there is a bet for just about every kind of category out there. Whether you're talking about politics, to weather, to AI, to Epstein, it is all on the table and able to be bet on. And the most dangerous part of all of this, you may wonder? You don't need to drive anywhere. You don't need to go and get cash from an ATM. You don't even need to get out of bed. You can sit or lay there on your phone and gamble away your entire life savings over your morning cup of coffee if you wanted to. It has quite literally never been easier to gamble in human history, and this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem that few people are willing to or able to stop. So, with that being said, here, my friends, join me today as we dive into the story of America's gambling problem, how it developed, how it got so bad, and whether or not anything will actually be done in order to resolve it, or if this will just be another aspect of the modern day that will be turned into a cultural meme. Buckle up, my friends. It is time that we take a step back away from the blackjack table and establish some context. To begin, my friends, gambling on the outcome of sporting events is something that is as old as, well, organized sport itself. That's a fact of life. And the United States has never really been an exception to that. In the colonial era, horse racing was one of the first widely popular spectator sports, and wagering on races was considered a gentleman's pursuit, embraced even by the founding generation. Just as a heads up, actually, to any of you who are watching this, I actually live in Kentucky, which is the horse capital of the United States, and every year I myself go down to the racetracks at Keeneland with my family, and I make some bets once or twice a year. That is something that we just do, though this amount has never exceeded $20 in total at any given point. So I don't want people thinking that I'm being a hypocrite when it is that I'm talking about this. It is a part of life here, and for many in history, that is exactly just, the way that things were. In fact, when I go and explain this, what it is that we would do is that we would go down to the racetracks, and at any given time, we would be there for like 4 or 5 races, and my wife would bet $2, I would bet $2, and my daughter would bet $2, and we don't even look at the stats on any of them. We literally would just go like, oh, this horse has a cool name, bet, and that's what we would do. And you know what? When you do it like that, it's fun. And we usually end up like losing a couple dollars or breaking even by the end. It's just a nice little fun thing to do. But that all being said, as the 19th century progressed and professional sports began to take shape within the United States, betting is something that became an inseparable companion to virtually every competitive endeavor you could possibly have. Boxing matches would draw enormous wagers, which would turn some fighters into superstars. Baseball, which emerged as the national pastime after the Civil War, would attract a thriving culture of gambling that would operate openly in and around ballparks. And it's from this that you would have bookmakers that would become fixtures of American sporting life. And for much of this period, there was really little legal infrastructure to regulate or prohibit their activities. As a result, the relationship between sports and gambling was symbiotic. Gambling would drive fan interest, and fan interest would drive gambling. That's just the way that it would work. However, nothing necessarily lasts forever, and history is definitely not kind to most things. That relationship was violently disrupted in 1919. This being when it was revealed that 8 members of the Chicago White Sox had conspired with gamblers to intentionally lose the World Series to the Cincinnati Reds. The Black Sox scandal, as it came to be known, is something that shook the foundations of professional sports in America. It wasn't just that the players had cheated, it was that the very integrity of competition, the foundational promise that you were watching something that was real, that had been compromised by money. And as a result of this, the fallout was severe. 8 players were banned from baseball for life by the newly appointed commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, and the scandal would usher in a decades-long era in which professional sports leagues treated gambling as an existential threat that had to be removed. Baseball would carve the prohibition against gambling into its fundamental rules, and the message was clear. Gambling and sports could not coexist without one corrupting the other. Something that carries forward to this very day, as you will pretty obviously see later. Either way, for much of the 20th century, legal gambling in the United States was confined to just a few narrow exceptions. Nevada would legalize casino gambling in 1931, and over the following decade, Las Vegas became the epicenter of American gambling culture. This is where, if you literally think of the word gambling, you are probably going to have just Vegas in your mind. Because of this, sports betting existed there in a regulated form starting in 1949, with licensed sports books going and operating inside of casinos. But outside of Nevada, sports betting was almost entirely illegal, driven underground into vast networks of local bookmakers and organized crime syndicates. That this is one of the ways in which they derived some authority as well as money-making capabilities. Over time, the federal government took several significant steps in order to formalize the prohibition. In 1961, President Kennedy would sign the Wire Act, which made it a federal crime to use wire communications, this being like, telephones, telegraphs, and later the internet, to go and transmit bets or betting information across state lines. The law was designed primarily as a tool against organized crime, which controlled much of the illegal bookmaking industry, and it was effective in disrupting some operations, but to be honest, even if it did something to kind of stop things, it did very little to actually diminish the underlying demand within American society. Americans wanted to bet on sports, and they found ways to do it regardless of what the law said. With time, the most consequential piece of legislation would come in 1992, this being with the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, commonly known as PASPA. This is something that was championed by Senator Bill Bradley of New Jersey, a former NBA player who had seen firsthand how gambling could threaten the integrity of sports. Now, PASPA effectively made it illegal for any state to authorize, license, or operate sports betting. Now, the law did, of course, grandfather in Nevada's existing sports books, and it provided narrow exemptions for Oregon, Delaware, and Montana, which had limited pre existing sports lottery schemes. But for the rest of the country, the door was effectively shut. This is exactly the way that it would remain for the next 26 years. If you wanted to legally bet on a football game, you had to do it in Las Vegas. There wasn't really anywhere else. And that was, well, that was pretty much that. But here's the thing. What PASPA did not do, however, was to eliminate the demand for sports betting. That is something that just always kind of existed. And as a result, the illegal market would flourish. By some estimates, Americans were spending billions of dollars or more per year on sports bets through illegal channels. This being like local bookies who would operate out of bars, barbershops, and back rooms, as well as a rapidly growing ecosystem of offshore online sportsbooks that were based in places like Costa Rica or Antigua or Curacao. These offshore sites operated in a kind of legal gray area. Technically speaking, they were illegal for Americans to use, but virtually impossible for authorities to ever go and shut down. The internet had thus made gambling accessible to anyone with a credit card and a web browser, and the prohibition regime was increasingly seen as both unenforceable as well as hypocritical from the exemptions and everything else that they did. So, this brings up an important question that a lot of people probably have then. When exactly does legalization begin? And the answer is that it was a gradual process, but by legal standards, not necessarily a slow one. You see, the seeds of legislation were planted not in a courtroom, but rather in the tech startup world. In the early 2010s, there were two companies. You had FanDuel, which was founded in 2009, so technically speaking before the 2010s, and then DraftKings, which was founded in 2012. And they would popularize a product called daily fantasy sports. Unlike traditional season-long fantasy leagues, daily fantasy allowed users to go and draft new lineups every single day and then compete for cash prizes based on how their selection of players performed in actual real games. The companies would market themselves aggressively, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising. And they insisted that their product was a game of skill. It wasn't gambling. You had to know how to be able to read the varying different skill levels of players, which allowed them to operate legally, technically speaking, under an exemption in the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act of 2006. Now, I say that, I do say that, but this distinction was always something that was tenuous at best, and many critics would argue that daily fantasy was simply sports betting that was dressed up in different clothes. Several states would launch investigations and even attempted to shut the companies down, most notably New York under Attorney General Eric Schneiderman. But the daily fantasy industry fought back with an army of lobbyists, and in most states it ultimately would prevail, securing legislation that would explicitly legalize and regulate the product. More importantly, the daily fantasy boom would accomplish something that years of policy arguments had not. It normalized the idea of betting money on the outcome of sporting events for millions of Americans. So it was then that by the time the Supreme Court took up the question of sports betting legalization, a significant cultural shift had already occurred right as the internet was becoming far more commonly used and more powerful than ever before in its history. So, how did this go down then? Well, the legal challenge to PASPA would originate in New Jersey. which had been trying for years to legalize sports betting as a way to revitalize its struggling Atlantic City casino industry. The state would hold a voter referendum in 2011 in which nearly two-thirds of voters would approve a constitutional amendment that would authorize sports betting at casinos and racetracks. When New Jersey would go and pass legislation to implement the amendment, it was immediately challenged by the NCAA and the four major professional sports leagues, who argued that PASPA prohibited such action. New Jersey would lose in the lower courts when things were decided, but they kept fighting, eventually crafting a creative legal strategy in which the state didn't explicitly authorize sports betting, but instead they would repeal their own prohibitions against it, arguing that PASPA would only prevent states from affirmatively authorizing gambling, not choosing to not prohibit it. So there's a difference of stating this is legal versus stating this is not illegal, I guess. That's where the problem is. The case would ultimately reach the Supreme Court as Murphy versus the National Collegiate Athletic Association, or the NCAA. And on May 14th, 2018, the court would rule 6-3 in New Jersey's favor, striking down PASPA as unconstitutional. Justice Samuel Alito, who was writing for the majority, would hold that PASPA violated the anti-commandeering doctrine of the 10th Amendment, which prohibits the federal government from compelling states to enforce federal regulatory schemes. In plain terms, the court said that Congress could regulate sports betting directly if it chose to, but it could not force individual states to keep sports betting illegal. The decision did not legalize sports betting nationwide. No, nothing like that. It simply removed the federal prohibition and left the question to each state. And once that happens, well, the response was immediate and dramatic. New Jersey would launch legal sports betting within weeks of the decision. Delaware, Mississippi, and West Virginia would all follow within months. By the end of 2018, 8 states had some form of legal sports betting. By the end of 2019, that number had grown substantially, and the pace would only accelerate from there. Now, why is this, you may wonder? After all, it's something that seems to be occurring at a very rapid rate. Why would so many states try to do this? Well, the answer is actually incredibly simple. It's a very simple question with a very simple answer, and I'm very glad you asked. The answer is money. Lots and lots and lots of money. For anyone who is not aware of by now, for how governments tend to work, considering everything that we have covered on this channel, I feel compelled to inform you that they have a tendency to have, or very quickly develop, money problems. Now, this can be due to a variety of different reasons, of course, whether it is because of war, corruption, or policies, etc., but the result is fairly similar regardless of what the reason is in the first place. In this case, what happened after Murphy versus the NCAA was not simply a gradual rollout, but a gold rush, as everyone was trying to rush in to make as much money as possible. State legislatures, many of them facing budget shortfalls and eager for new sources of tax revenue, would move quickly to authorize sports betting. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began in early 2020, that is something that paradoxically accelerated this trend. Because with state budgets that were now being decimated by lockdowns and economic shutdowns, because, after all, if no economic activity is occurring, that means nothing can actually be taxed, gambling revenue became an even more attractive proposition. Meanwhile, the shift to online and mobile platforms during the pandemic meant that sports betting could thrive even when physical casinos and sportsbooks were closed. It was effectively a perfect storm in 2020, much in the way that I just so happened to actually start working for a medical testing laboratory a few months before the pandemic hit. Yes, my friends, for those of you that talk about my luck with traveling and global events, please understand that that has always existed somehow, but in different forms where the luck just seems to follow me in one negative way, shape, or form. I worked 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week at that job. It is the reason why I actually started doing social media and why I can work as much as it is that I do now and feel that this is completely normal. Everything is fine. Anyway, back to gambling. The mobile-first model proved to be the decisive factor for the industry's explosive growth. In states that authorized online and mobile wagering, as opposed to it only being allowed in person, betting volumes were dramatically higher. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Colorado, Illinois, Michigan, Virginia, New York, and a whole bunch of others all launched mobile platforms that allowed anyone within state borders to place a bet with just a few taps on their smartphone. Among all the ones that I just listed, though, New York's launch in January of 2022, that was particularly significant. Why, you may wonder? Well, despite imposing one of the highest tax rates in the country on operators at a whopping 51% of gross gaming revenue, the state's enormous population, as well as wealth concentration, made it instantly the largest sports betting market in the entire country, generating over $1 billion in handle in its first month alone. As a result, in just the first 30 days, the state managed to collect over $70 million in tax revenue, according to Governor Kathy Hochul. By the end of its first year in 2022, the state had generated over $693 million in tax revenue, which is already pretty impressive, but from there, that is something that would only grow. All at once, it seemed, just like how provinces in China could seemingly print GDP growth through pointless infrastructure projects, US states could print money out of thin air by opening themselves up to gambling. Most of those that did not do so immediately very quickly began to follow suit once it was realized just how much money they could actually make and how easy it was, as it didn't really require them to do anything. By early 2026, more than 38 states plus the District of Columbia have legalized some form of sports betting, and more are considering it even now. The legal handle, this being the total amount wagered, has grown from around $13 billion in the year 2019 to over $120 billion by 2023, and it's estimated now in 2026 it is over $150 billion, with continued growth expected in subsequent years. Annual revenue to sportsbook operators is in the multi-billions, and the industry shows no signs of slowing down. DraftKings, FanDuel, all of these have emerged as the dominant players, controlling approximately 70 to 80% of the online market between them, with BetMGM, Caesars, ESPN Bet, and Fanatics Sportsbooks competing for the rest. It is huge. It really is. The market that we are talking about here is something that is truly massive. And so it is here, my friends, then, that we really need to start getting into the problems that spawned this video in the first place. The first thing that I want to address in all of this, just because of my own personal pet peeve, even if it's not necessarily something that is really a problem, it's a problem in my book, and many people could actually argue that it really is a problem. I freaking hate it. Advertising, the freaking sports advertising. The advertising onslaught has been extraordinary from these bet companies. Sportsbook companies have spent billions of dollars on marketing, flooding sports broadcasts, podcasts, social media, even stadiums with their branding. Major sports leagues that once treated gambling as a mortal threat that they would not touch have now fully embraced it. The NFL, NBA, MLB, and NHL all have official sportsbook partnerships worth enormous sums of money. ESPN, the most powerful brand in sports media, they would launch their own branded sportsbook in partnership with Penn Entertainment. Team jerseys carry sportsbook patches. Stadiums house betting lounges. Pre-game and halftime shows are sponsored by gambling companies. The integration is now so complete that it is nearly impossible to consume professional sports content in America without being exposed to gambling, advertising, and messaging. That is just a fact of life if you get into sports at all. And I say this as a guy who just this past year, like literally this past fall, I just got into watching hockey. You've probably seen my post of being down in Nashville supporting the Predators at their game. I know, YouTube team. I get it. The jokes write themselves. This stuff is everywhere. And personally, for me, there are several mobile games that I play on my phone when I have a little downtime at night. And you know how in a lot of these free mobile games, the way they actually make money is by subjecting you to a lot of ads and then microtransactions in the game to get more in-game items, as well as the ability to turn off said ads? Well, I'm cheap and I refuse to do that. So I get bombarded with these all the time. And I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that across the main 3 games that I play, approximately 50% of all ads are for Kalshi alone. That is just one. That is just one of the companies we're talking about here. This is not talking about any of the casino apps or any other source of gambling, which, if I do count those, we're probably talking in mobile ad terms about it being 75% or more. It is absolutely insane. But what it is that I have stated here is something that, as I said, comes more from a position of personal annoyance. There are much bigger problems at play here. Because beneath the celebratory narrative of economic growth and consumer freedom, there is a public health crisis that is quietly growing. Gambling addiction, clinically known as gambling disorder, is a recognized condition in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it shares many neurological characteristics with substance addiction. Problem gamblers experience the same cycles of craving, tolerance, withdrawal, and compulsive behavior that characterize drug and alcohol dependence. And the consequences are similarly devastating, whether we're talking financial ruin, destroyed relationships, depression, anxiety, and in the worst case, offing oneself. The legalization and particularly the mobilization of sports betting is something that has dramatically expanded the population that has been exposed to these risks. Before 2018, a person who wanted to go and place a legal sports bet had to physically travel to Nevada. That is not the case. Today, more than half of the American population lives in a state where they can open an app and place a bet in literally just seconds. You who is watching this probably can do it right now if you haven't already. At any hour of the day or night, from anywhere, their couch, their workplace, a bar, a bathroom, their bed at 3 in the morning, it doesn't matter. You could do it at any point. Every possible friction point that once existed between the impulse to gamble and the act of gambling has been systematically removed. And the result is a product that is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It requires no social interaction, it carries no visible social stigma, and can be used in complete secrecy until, well, the financial damage becomes impossible to hide, which is a problem for a lot of people. The National Council on Problem Gambling has reported significant increases in calls to gambling helplines across the country since legalization, with some states seeing call volumes double or triple. Research published in various journals have found elevated rates of problem gambling among populations with access to mobile sports betting compared to those without. Young men, in particular, between the ages of 18 and 34, are especially vulnerable, both because they are the demographic that are most aggressively targeted by sportsbook marketing, and because they also, admittedly, tend to have higher rates of risk-taking behavior and lower levels of financial stability. That is something that is a factor of life. College campuses have become hotbeds of gambling activity, with students betting on games using money that, quite frankly, they don't have, as oftentimes this could be coming from their loans and then racking up debts that follow them well into adulthood. It is bad. But one of the most troubling aspects of the industry's business model that a lot of people don't really pay attention to is the degree to which the whole system depends on problem gamblers for its own profitability. While sportsbook companies will publicly promote responsible gambling and point to their self-exclusion programs and deposit limits, internal industry dynamics tell a very different story. Research has consistently suggested that a disproportionate share of gambling revenue, with some estimates ranging from it being as low as 40% to as high as 60%, all of this comes from individuals who meet the clinical criteria for problem gambling, or are at high risk for developing the actual problem itself. Now, these are not casual bettors that, like, what I was talking about before with my horse racing with my family, where, oh, we're going to bet $1 or $2 here, and we're going to do that 3 or 4 times for the day, and then we're going to go home and do that again in 6 months. No, 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 no. This isn't the people who are betting a few dollars at the Super Bowl. These are people who are trapped in cycles of compulsive behavior, chasing losses, borrowing money, lying to their families, and betting way beyond their means. The sports books know who these customers are. Their algorithms can identify patterns of problematic behavior with remarkable precision. But the financial incentive is to keep these customers betting, not to intervene. Winning bettors get their accounts limited or shut down. Losing bettors get VIP treatment. They get free bets. They get promotional offers designed to keep them engaged. Really, to be blunt with you, it would be fairly accurate to describe these tactics as, quite simply, predatory. And that is not accidental either. This is something that is done by design. It is the product of a sophisticated behavioral engineering program, something that draws on the same principles that make social media platforms the way they are, that makes video games so fun and addictive, that makes slot machines so compulsive. Every element of the user experience is optimized to encourage continued engagement and spending. You want people to continue to play. And in some cases, like when we talk about things with video games, when it's not ones that are filled with microtransactions, this could be something that is just to continue the fun experience and for people to enjoy themselves. But the moment that you start putting money into the whole thing, that is where it becomes a major problem. Push notifications will go and alert users to upcoming games and betting opportunities. Promotional offers will go and create a sense of urgency and scarcity. The interface is sleek, it's colorful, it's fast. It's something that is designed to minimize the psychological weight of spending money. Losses are presented in muted tones. Wins are celebrated with animations and sounds. All of these things push the user deeper and deeper in. But there is another aspect that is far more dangerous now in the modern day, as it is something that never really existed before in history: live betting. And that, my friends, is something that I'm going to need to explain here. The introduction of live in game betting and micro betting is something that has been particularly consequential. Traditional sports betting involves placing a wager before a game starts, and then you have to wait a couple hours for the outcome to be real, and then you're able to confirm your results. But live betting allows users to place wagers on events within a game as it is still happening. Whether we're talking about the outcome of the next drive, the next at bat, the next possession, micro betting takes this even further, offering bets on the outcome of individual pitches, plays, or points, with results being determined in literally seconds. Like you could have something as simple as, oh, will this basketball team score a three-pointer in the next 10 seconds? And that's it. You could just literally have something like that. This rapid cycle of wager and then getting the resolution very quickly, all of this mimics the mechanics of slot machines, which are widely regarded as some of the most addictive forms of gambling, precisely because they compress the time between bet and outcome to almost nothing. The faster the cycle, the harder it is for the gambler to pause, to reflect, and to disengage. They continue and continue and continue. Live and micro betting products effectively transform a 3-hour football game into hundreds of individual gambling events, each one a fresh opportunity to chase a loss or to ride a winning streak. This is, again, by design. And the marketing strategies that are employed by the industry are equally as calculated. The phrase risk-free bet, that is something that became ubiquitous in sportsbook advertising. Though it is fundamentally wrong, it is very misleading. What it typically means is that if your first bet loses, you receive a credit for another bet. Not a cash refund. You don't get your money back from that. You just get the opportunity to place another bet. The purpose is to get new users to make their first wager, knowing that the simple act of placing that initial bet is a very critical threshold. Because once a person has crossed that line, the probability that they will continue betting is something that increases dramatically. Deposit bonuses, odd boosts, parlay promotions, and referral rewards all serve the same kind of function. They lower the perceived risk and increase the engagement from the user, locking them into behavioral loops that benefit the operator at the expense of the bettor themselves. And the worst part is, the way I'm phrasing this obviously sounds very insidious, but all of this is considered completely normal and acceptable now. It is no longer possible to watch a major sporting event on American television without being bombarded by gambling references. Pre-game shows will feature segments on betting lines and player props. Commentators will reference point spreads during live broadcasts. Entire media companies have reoriented their content strategy around gambling, producing podcasts, articles, and social media posts that are designed to drive betting activity. The message, delivered relentlessly and from every direction, is quite simply that betting on sports is not just acceptable, it is an essential part of the fan experience, that you are missing out if you're not doing it. This normalization is perhaps the most insidious effect of legalization, because it reshapes cultural attitudes in a way that makes it harder for individuals to recognize when their behavior has probably crossed the line from entertainment into being a straight-up compulsion. And that compulsion, my friends, that is something that has serious consequences. Financial counselors and bankruptcy attorneys across the country have reported growing caseloads directly attributable to sports betting losses. People who never have set foot in a casino in their entire life are now accumulating tens of thousands of dollars in debt through literally just their phones, oftentimes funding the bets with credit cards, personal loans, or money that has been borrowed from family members. The secrecy that mobile betting enables makes the problem especially dangerous, Because unlike a person who disappears to a casino for hours at a time, a mobile sports bettor can maintain the appearance of normalcy while their financial life completely collapses around them in silence. Spouses will go and discover the debt only when bill collectors call or when a mortgage payment bounces. Parents will learn about it when their child suddenly drops out of college. The shame and secrecy are things that compound the problem, delaying intervention and deepening the damage because it's just not obvious. It's not there until it is just there. Of course, when it is that I'm talking about these things, my friends, I'm speaking in very general terms. So a lot of people may be a little bit confused as to how much damage we are talking about here. So allow me to cite some statistics for you. Between July 7th and July 9th of 2025, US News, which is, go figure, an American news organization. I know, shocker from that name, by the way. They ran a nationwide survey of Americans who placed a sports bet in the previous 6 months. They would ask 1,200 respondents about their betting habits and their finances, and how their sports betting would impact various aspects of their financial health. And what they found, quite frankly, was not good. Around one quarter of sports bettors said that they were unable to pay a bill because of wagers that they had made. Some respondents said that they actually bet their rent money on sporting events. Almost a third of these, like 30% of sports bettors, said that they actually have debts that are specifically attributed to gambling. Of those with debts related to sports betting, more than half, like 51%, were facing debts of $500 or more. Over 15% of sports bettors said that they had to take out personal loans in order to be able to fund their wagers, and 12% of respondents said that they had taken out high-interest payday loans to bankroll their bets. From that, around 45% said that they hadn't saved up enough emergency funds to cover 3 to 6 months of living expenses, the amount that many financial experts recommend. One quarter of sports bettors were worried that they couldn't control their gambling, and about 9% of responders said that they had to seek treatment for gambling addiction. Now, obviously, when it is that we're talking about this here, my friends, we're talking about a survey of 1,200 people who chose to respond, so obviously these numbers can be a bit skewed. But still, even considering if those rates were halved, it's not good. That is not good at all. And that is just the financials. There is a deeply social aspect here that is unpleasant. 21% of sports bettors say that they verbally have abused an athlete, either in person or mostly online, after losing money on a bet. More than a quarter of respondents between the age of 35 and 44 said that they lashed out at an athlete over a wager, the highest rate of any age group in the survey. Mind you, what it is that we are describing here is just the sports side. You remember how I mentioned there in the beginning that there are even bets going on right now about events in the Iran war? Well, here, right now, and I'm probably going to put this up right now, we have an article from The Atlantic titled, and I kid you not, this is actually the title, "Maybe Turning War into a Casino Was a Bad Idea." Which I feel like if I was just focusing on that one particular topic, that would be the title of my YouTube video. It reads, on March 10th, the journalist Emmanuel Fabian reported on a missile that had been launched from Iran. The warhead hit an open area outside of Jerusalem, which Fabian would confirm by speaking with rescue services and receiving footage of the explosion. He wrote a short post on the Times of Israel's live blog, and he moved on. Meanwhile, gamblers had wagered millions on the unfolding events of the conflict, and Fabian's post became the subject of a major dispute on Polymarket, a popular prediction market where people can bet on the outcome of almost anything. The site had allowed users to guess when Iran would initiate a drone, missile, or airstrike on Israel's soil, and more than $14 million was riding on whether such an attack had happened on March 10th. So, people started reaching out asking Fabian to change his article. Some argued that Israel Defense Forces had not officially mentioned such an attack occurring on that day, and others said that the explosion he had reported on was the result of a missile being intercepted, which, according to Polymarket's terms, wouldn't count as a strike on Israeli soil. Confident in his reporting, though, Fabian did not amend the text. Now, for anyone who is curious about this, what, might you wonder, would be the result of this? Well, the answer is that he started getting spam messages, requests changing to angry demands, changing to active threats. People started sending faked images showing him admitting that he was wrong in previous response messages that had never actually taken place in the first place, and then demanding to know when he would actually update his article. Like, here's just one example of the threatening messages that I will go ahead and read aloud, and there is a lot of these. This says, and I quote, "You have exactly an hour to correct your attempted influence. Despite the fact that you've received countless inquiries, you insist on leaving it that way. If you do not correct this by 1 Israeli time today, March 15th, you are bringing upon yourself damage you have never imagined you would suffer. After you make us lose $900,000, we will invest no less than that to finish you. You have two choices. Either believe that we have the capabilities, and after you make us lose $900,000, we will invest no less than that to finish you, or end this with money in your pocket, and also earn back the life you had until now." End quote. Oh, by the way, side note here, this same user making the threats attempted to call the journalist many times via WhatsApp along with these messages. And this, my friends, again, this is one example, and that is not even American. That is Israeli, probably. But it just goes to show how bad the problem is becoming as betting moves out of sports and goes global on every stupid little facet of the world. Still, if we try to move things back into just the sphere of sports betting again, the picture does not exactly get much better. Because the relationship between problem gambling and offing oneself, that is well documented and deeply alarming. Problem gamblers have significantly elevated rates of, at least having ideas of doing the deed, and as well as the actual attempts compared to the general population. And some studies have found that the rate of doing this among pathological gamblers is higher here than for any other addictive disorder. And also, I want to stress before it is that I move on from here, the reason why I'm not using the word is because YouTube is really annoying and they go and punish me for doing it. So I apologize for that. I know there's going to be some comments about this, but as the number of problem gamblers in the United States grows, which is, a direct and predictable consequence of the expanded access where millions of more people are getting into it, gambling related, offing attempts are growing as well. Families have come forward to share their stories, describing loved ones who took their own lives after spiraling into gambling debt that they saw no way to escape. And these deaths are largely invisible in the data because there is no real systematic national tracking of gambling related that. Coroners and medical experts rarely note gambling as a contributing factor, and the industry just has no real incentive to fund the kind of research that would quantify the problem in the first place. It is not a good thing, and the impact on college athletes and the integrity of college sports has also become a significant concern. Since legalization, there have been multiple high-profile cases of college athletes betting on their own games or on other sports in violation of NCAA rules, and in some cases, state and federal law. Investigations at schools including the University of Iowa, Iowa State University, University of Alabama, and others have resulted in suspensions, expulsions, and criminal charges. The underlying dynamic is fairly straightforward. College athletes are young people, oftentimes young men from modest financial backgrounds that are surrounded by a culture that constantly glorifies and promotes sports betting, and they need the money. They have insider knowledge of their own sports, their own teams, and the temptation to use that knowledge is immense. The more normalized sports betting becomes, the more inevitable these integrity violations are. They are simply a fact of life that are guaranteed to happen, and that is the college side. By the time you get into professional sports, the amount of money at play becomes significantly larger and way more damaging. As just an example of what it is that I'm talking about here, just around 4 or 5 months ago, at the time I'm making this video, which is, again, end of March 2026, in November of 2025, there were 2 pitchers for the Cleveland Guardians that were charged in a conspiracy for rigging pitches. Which yes, I will need to explain what that actually means. Basically, they conspired with outside forces to throw certain pitches at certain points in the game, which in the past would have been used to win or rather intentionally lose the game. But in this case, it was far more insidious. 3 years prior to 2025, there were a few corrupt bettors that approached the pitchers with a very simple but very strong offer. The gamblers would bet that certain pitches would be balls rather than strikes. And so, in order to ensure that, the pitchers just needed to throw those pitches into the dirt at that specific moment. After everything was done, the gamblers would give the pitchers some of the money, and because they were not throwing the whole game, just like 1 or 2 pitches over the course of an entire match, no one would ever really be the wiser, it seems. And hey, guess what? The plan worked. It worked really well, and it's pretty obvious as to why. There are hundreds of pitches that are thrown in a baseball game, and no one is going to care about one bad pitch unless, of course, that pitch was going to determine the winner of the game. They could keep the entire thing under the radar without screwing over other players of the game or the viewers. They were really only screwing over some other gamblers that were trying to get in on that specific bet, but did not know that it was rigged. As a result, before their plan was finally found out, they had managed to win around $450,000 from pitches that no one else would ever really be paying attention to. If their plan had continued, we could be talking about a level of fraud that would have easily been in the millions of dollars. Which, on that note, actually, speaking of fraud or other such things, remember before how I was talking about the issue with the journalist being threatened because of his article on that one missile strike in Israel? That is only a single example of just how devious geopolitical betting has become. And yes, I'm using air quotes there because it is extremely obvious for certain bets that they are not really bets at all, but rather examples of obvious insider knowledge being used for financial gain in the same way that some politicians will go and play the stock market while handling legislation that pertains to them, which is its own insidious little thing. Like, guys, the corruption here is so blatant, it's not even funny. I can't laugh because it's just that incredibly stupid. On the morning of February 28th, an individual went onto Polymarket and placed an extremely large wager on the belief that the United States would carry out airstrikes against Iran that day. Even though the likelihood of such an event occurring was ridiculously low, obviously, even after the months of buildup that had occurred prior to this point that I've covered in previous episodes, so you definitely need to go and check that out, it's still really low odds. But despite the naturally very low odds, as I'm sure you are aware, hours later, that is exactly what happened. The result? A user by the name of MAGA My Man would walk away with $553,000 in winnings. Now, that seems insane, I know. But what is even crazier is that it was not an isolated incident. It was one among dozens of suspiciously well-timed bets, collectively worth millions of dollars, all placed in a brief window before hostilities commenced. And that just seems so incredibly bad. I mean, my friends, while there are many things that are possible, even if they seem unlikely, the thought, the idea that whoever is behind the MAGA My Man account was operating without any privileged knowledge sourced from within the administration would just be plain ridiculous. This is very obviously someone who took advantage of their position and knowledge to abuse what is already a highly abused and manipulative system that people can very easily see as happening and then get angry about, of course. Like in the past, the big thing that people would typically get mad about in the United States when it came to war was the military-industrial complex and its influence in politics and its relationship with conflict in general. But what has happened here now is that we have entered an era in which not only can online gamblers cash in on warfare, but those with direct influence over military decisions are presented with stupidly easy opportunities to earn stupidly large sums of money by betting on their own military operations. It simply boggles the mind that this is real in 2026. It sounds dystopian, but it is real. It's insane. But now, at this point, my friends, we have gone over how and why gambling became as prominent as it has in the United States, but we haven't really explored the problems that are occurring at the state level, because there are problems. People just don't really realize it. On that note, one of the central arguments made in favor of legalization in the first place was that it would allow states to regulate the industry, to protect consumers, and generate meaningful tax revenue. In practice, the regulatory framework has been woefully inadequate. Most states have established gaming commissions or regulatory bodies to oversee sports betting, but these agencies are frequently underfunded, understaffed, and just simply outmatched by the legal and financial resources of the operators that they are supposed to regulate. We're talking billions of dollars more.
Who's gonna tell him that after the little break earlier, he came back with insane amounts of makeup on? That's not super professional.
Anyone want to bet on when baby number 2 is going to come into existence?
Bro, you cannot. Nobody bet on that. I'm infertile. Dude, you're rigging this.
No, that's why it would be a good bet, because you're infertile, so no one would be able to know. That is legitimately a good bet. I know there is. Someone's going to make a betting pool, I know. Anyway, as I said, outclassed by billions. And in some states, the regulatory bodies have essentially been captured by the industry, staffed by former industry executives, and influenced by the lobbying dollars that flow freely through the state capitals. It's like the equivalent of an environmental commission being operated by a bunch of oil executives. It's fairly obvious as to where there's a bit of a problem. And so the funding that is dedicated to problem gambling prevention and treatment is extremely small relative to the scale of the issue itself. Most states allocate less than 1% of their gambling tax revenue to problem gambling programs. Some allocate nothing at all. And the contrast with the industry's marketing spending is ridiculous. For every dollar that is spent on problem gambling services, the industry spends hundreds or even thousands of dollars on advertising, just advertising, that is designed to recruit new bettors and keep existing ones engaged. Self-exclusion programs, which allow individuals to voluntarily ban themselves from betting platforms, that exists in most states but are inconsistently administered. They are poorly publicized and they're very easy to just get around, especially in the online environment where a person can quite frankly just go and make a new account with different information or use some offshore site. Like, there's an infinite number of possibilities you have there. Meanwhile, the revenue argument, which is one of the big drivers behind why all this was done in the first place, that has not actually really lived up to its promise. Because while sports betting does generate tax revenue, this is a fact of life, it absolutely does, the amounts are modest in the context of state budgets that typically run into the tens or hundreds of billions of dollars. Many states allow operators to deduct promotional spending from their taxable revenue, which significantly reduces the actual tax intake, so you're not getting as much out of it. In states with lower tax rates, the net revenue to the state can be surprisingly small. And even in states like New York with stupidly high tax rates, the revenue, which, while yes, that is substantial in absolute terms because we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, that is still something that represents only a tiny fraction of the overall budget. When weighed against the social cost of expanded gambling, whether that is addiction treatment, lost workplace productivity, my cat now jumping on me because she heard about people suffering and decided that she wants to join us. Gambling is something that ends up creating significantly more problems in society. It increases demand on social services. It increases family disruption. It increases criminal justice expenses. As a result, the net benefit to states is oftentimes far less clear than proponents ever promised. Because yes, you can make a bunch of money in the short term, but in the long term, you could end up paying for it dearly. Wow, that sounds a lot like gambling. Perhaps the most profound and lasting consequence of the post-2018 era is the cultural transformation in how Americans relate to sports, though. A generation of young fans is growing up in an environment where betting lines and prop bets are as fundamental to the sports experience as whatever the score actually is. The language of gambling, spreads, parlays, over-unders, bad beats, juice, all this has become the lingua franca of sports conversation. Fantasy sports and betting apps have gamified the viewing experience to such an extent that some fans even struggle to maintain any interest in a game that they don't have money riding on. Like, you see this actual language in advertisement for sports betting services that if you are not making bets while watching sports, you're just wasting your time. Like, I kid you not, that has actually been in a number of ads for varying different sports betting services. As a result, the intrinsic pleasures of athletic competition, whether we're talking about the beauty of just a well-executed play, the drama of a game being so close and finally getting resolved, the loyalty that one has to a team, these things are still there, yes, but as time goes on, they are increasingly becoming subordinated to the question of whether the result covered the spread that you had in the first place when you made your bets. And that shift, oh my God, Moonbeam. And that shift, that is something that has implications that go way beyond individual behavior. It changes the relationship between fans and athletes. It introduces a far more transactional dynamic in which a player's value is measured not only by their contribution to a win, but by their performance relative to a betting line. Athletes have reported receiving threats and abuse from bettors who lost money because of their performance. It's one of those things we talked about in the beginning. And the toxicity of this dynamic is corrosive, and it falls most heavily on younger and less prominent athletes who lack the insulation that fame and wealth provide as people stop caring. It can be damaging to their psyche. The professional leagues, for their part, they have been enthusiastic participants in this transformation, motivated by the billions of dollars that are flowing into them through partnership deals and the increased viewership and engagement that gambling drives. The NFL, which for decades maintained a very strict public stance against gambling, is now the single biggest driver of sports betting revenue in the entire country. The league's embrace of gambling is total. Official sportsbook sponsors, in-stadium betting lounges, gambling content woven into broadcasts, and a schedule structure, with Thursday, Sunday, and Monday games. That is perfectly designed to sustain continuous betting activity throughout the week. The hypocrisy here is absolutely insane. It is just truly insane, especially when viewed against the league's historical treatment of players. People like Paul Hornung, Alex Karras, and Art Schlichter, all individuals that were suspended or banned because of gambling. Like today, the league doesn't just tolerate gambling, it profits from it. It profits from it at a scale that those players never could have imagined, that they were heavily punished for, and yet here it is now fully embraced. As of 2026, my friends, there are signs of a growing backlash, something that has been brewing in the background, though it is something that remains to be seen whether or not it will translate into any meaningful policy change. Several states have begun to tighten restrictions on gambling advertising, especially during live sports broadcasts and on platforms that are frequented by minors. There is increasing bipartisan interest at the federal level in establishing national standards for problem gambling funding, for advertising transparency, and data privacy. Advocacy organizations, families of people who have lost their lives to gambling addiction, and some legislators are pushing for reforms that would force the industry to bear a greater share of the social costs that it generates. But the industry is deeply entrenched at this point, and it is very politically powerful. Sportsbook operators, the professional leagues, and their allied lobbying organizations spend enormous sums influencing state and federal policy. States that have become accustomed to gambling revenue, even if it is modest in the grand scheme of things, are reluctant to impose restrictions that might reduce it, because that's still taking away money. And the cultural normalization of sports betting has progressed to the point where any attempt to scale it back faces the perception of being paternalistic or outdated or anti-freedom or any number of other things. It is something that is genuinely very popular, and that popularity is part of its biggest problem. But that, my friends, is actually something that I want to pause on and address more here just for a second. I'm quite glad that I made this episode when it is that I did, because right now I am filming this on the night of March 30th. And when it is that I woke up this morning, there was an article that was released from ESPN that popped up on my phone that was titled, "NFL Asks Prediction Markets to Stop Manipulable Trading." And I love that. So I'm going to need to talk about this now. You may wonder, what exactly does this mean? Are we actually seeing a shift take place the moment that I suddenly decide to address the whole issue in the first place? I didn't even have to travel? Well, here is what the article says. It says, and I quote, "In letters sent Sunday, the NFL asked prediction market operators such as Kalshi and Polymarket to refrain from offering trades on events that can be easily manipulated or determined in advance, including what announcers say during broadcasts, which celebrities attend games, and the upcoming draft. The NFL said that it wanted to protect game participants from, quote, unfair and unwanted allegations, end quote, tied to gambling and prediction markets, and objected to 4 types of offerings. Those that can be easily manipulated by a single person, such as missed field goals, those that are knowable in advance, such as draft picks, player signings and coach firings, or anything related to officiating, and inherently objectionable topics such as player injuries and fan safety. Most of the NFL's objections in the letter are similar to what it asks traditional sportsbooks to prohibit, but the league also raised concerns about the trading on broadcaster-mentioned markets and celebrity attendance, 2 propositions that are not usually offered by sportsbooks. Millions of dollars were traded on Kalshi on what announcers would say and which celebrities would appear at the Super Bowl. Quote, some people are going to have that information, and they can then share it. End quote. This coming from NFL Executive Vice President Jeff Miller, as he would tell ESPN. We're trying to stay as far as we can from some of those sorts of inside information wagers that could exist in this space. End quote. And now look, I know that I said a lot here because a lot of that was obviously from the article. And there's more in the article, and I definitely recommend that you go back and read it. But you see what it is that I mean. This is the industry realizing that things within the betting sphere have gone way too far, from simple bets on sports games to something that is far more insidious than people want to give it credit for. They are realizing that just like with Iran and other geopolitical events, that there are people with insider information that could very easily ruin all sense of fairness in a game. And this has terrible consequences for people that are involved. Literally, if an announcer wanted to go on Polymarket and make a bet that at the next Raiders game that the announcer was going to say Baba Booey or some kind of thing, they could just do it. They could just do it and fulfill it themselves and then immediately rake in a whole bunch of money. That is what exists right now. That is something that can actually happen, and it's just crazy to think that people have overseen this. But what we were talking about from that article, though, is nothing more than a suggestion. Right now, nothing has legally been done per se, at least at the time that I am recording this on the evening of March 30th, 2026. Who knows? Maybe something will pass very quickly after this. I can't necessarily say. We could make a bet on it. But that leaves us here, then, in the end, in a rather uncomfortable position. The United States is conducting an enormous, largely unregulated experiment on its own population. It has taken a product with well-documented addictive properties, and it's made it available to the overwhelming majority of adult Americans through the most efficient delivery mechanism that has ever been invented, allowing it to be marketed with virtually no restrictions by companies that have nearly unlimited budgets and provided minimal resources for those that are harmed by it. The consequences of this experiment are accumulating. They may have just begun recently in the last couple of years, but this is something that is only going to grow. We're talking destroyed finances, broken families, in lost lives, and so much more. And the country has barely begun to reckon with what it has unleashed. The question is no longer whether or not legalized sports betting is causing harm, it's whether the political will actually exists to do anything about it before the damage becomes irreversible for millions of Americans who were told by every institution that they trusted that placing a bet, well, that's just part of being a fan. With that, my friends, we are here at the end of today's video. I know this is something that was different than a lot of what I have usually done, but this is something that has both personally annoyed me from everything it is that I have seen, and the more stuff that has come out in articles, the more that I have realized just how bad this problem has been growing. Mark my words, the problem may not be dealt with now, but you are going to be seeing major shifts and backlash likely within the next half decade. That is my prediction. Already, with what it is that we have seen here in 2026 and the amount of things that are being exploited on the geopolitical level, people are taking note. This is not something that is just under the radar. And people are getting pissed off at how very easily manipulated all of these things are. Still, I'm going on about it too much. We are here at the end. Thank you all very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Let me know in the comment section below what it is that you'd like to see next. And if you want to travel with me, by all means, check the links out down in my description. You can join me here in Croatia, Greece, or we are also traveling to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And as we travel, we can watch the world burn around us. Yeah, fun times. Thank you all, and I'll see you all here next time. Goodbye, my friends.